All right, so one of the main tasks that you have when it comes to poetry analysis is that you have to come to conclusions about what the rhythm of a poem actually is. So the technical term for the rhythm of a poem is meter. And unless you are specifically told what the meter of a poem is, you're going to have to figure out yourself using the process of scansion, which we were talking about before, this entire break that we're having right now. But before we get to that, we have to define a few of the basic concepts that you need to know when you are writing about poetic rhythm.
All right, so all words have clear syllables. I'm sure most of you understand that concept. We typically divide words into syllables by just simply listening to the words being pronounced and then listening for the pauses in that pronunciation. All right, while we're listening to these pauses, you're going to also hear which of these syllables are emphasized more than others. The emphasized syllables are known as stressed syllables, while the non emphasized syllables are known as unstressed syllables. All right, so the combination and number of stressed and unstressed syllables in any line of poetry is what dictates that poem's rhythm or meter. So you see some examples on this slide. The word angel, the way that it is pronounced, the first syllable is stress, whereas the word complete, the way that that is pronounced, the second syllable is stress. So it all depends on the proper pronunciation of a word. You can see here a list of common words and the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables that they follow. All right, so this idea of the scansion process, I know I discussed this before we went on this long break. We're going to go into more detail about this right now. Okay, so the scansion process is the process of breaking the lines of a poem down to their patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables, then using that information to determine the poem's meter. All right, so the first step in the process of scansion is to mark the stressed syllables in the lines of poetry. All right, at least in the first couple of lines of whichever poem it is that you're analyzing. All right, the way that you mark a stressed syllable is with a little dash, as you can see on the PowerPoint above, say the word sun in that first line. That little dash is how you mark a stressed syllable. Marking an unstressed syllable, you put that little divot, the one that looks like a little U. That is how you mark a unstressed syllable. Once you've done this, then you want to look for where that pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables starts to repeat itself, and you can mark off each one of those instances of repetition. So if you see in that first line where it says this sunlight shames November where he grieves, the pattern, the repeating pattern in that line is unstressed, stressed. And then you have a little divided a diagonal line that divides up that first pattern, and then so on and so forth until you get to the end of the line. So you can see that there are 5 instances of that pattern of unstressed syllable, stressed syllable. Now, every time you mark off one of those stressed, unstressed combinations in that, or anytime that in that example that we just looked at, anytime one of those stressed, unstressed combinations are marked off with a diagonal line, that one instance of that stressed, unstressed symbol combination is known as a poetic foot. The combination of these poetic feet in any single line of poetry is what dictates that poem's meter or rhythm. All right, so to summarize, 1, scanning a poem is the process of marking the stressed and unstressed syllables in a poem, then finding out where those stressed and unstressed syllables start to show a repeating pattern. 2, each of those repeated patterns is known as a poetic foot. 3, the combination of poetic feet in a line of poetry dictates the poem's meter. All right, now there's 2 types of meter that you should be able to identify when you're writing your poetry analysis: rising meters and falling meters. Rising meters are lines in poetry that move from the pattern of unstressed syllables to stressed syllables. So starting off with unstressed and then moving towards stressed. Falling meters are the exact opposite. They move from stressed to unstressed. Now, we discussed last class, or a couple weeks ago, we discussed the idea of masculine versus feminine rhymes. The same concept applies to the meters within a poem. All right, so a masculine ending is when a line in poetry ends with a stressed syllable, whereas a feminine ending is a line of poetry that ends with an extra unstressed syllable. All right, so a couple other terms that are related to meter. We have the term caesura. This occurs when there is a pause within a line of poetry that is indicated with a double vertical line, as you can see on the slide. An end stop line is a line that ends in a period, forcing a pause at the end of the sentence, at the end of the line. And on the other side of that, we have the run-on line, which is a line that ends without a period, no pause, and continues into the next line, which is also known as enjambment. Now, all of these terms and this idea of scansion is to partly help you with your analysis, and you need to make sure that you can properly identify the parts of a poem when you are discussing them in your paper. But they're also an introduction to the main part of our discussion today, which is actually identifying the meter of a poem. All right, so the process of scansion is just the first part of the process of identifying the meter of a poem. Once you scan the poem, then you have to identify the type of poetic foot that is in the poem, as well as how many of those feet are in each line. Using that combination of that information, you can figure out what the meter of a poem is. All right, so as far as identifying the type of poetic foot, there are 5 main patterns of poetic feet, which we use to identify most of the poetry that you're going to analyze in class. All right, so you have iambic, trochaic, anapestic, and dactylic, and spondaic. So at any given point, when you're looking at the single instance of a repeated pattern, when you've done the scansion process, you're going to identify the poetic foot using one of these terms. All right, so to explain these in a little bit more detail. Starting with the iambic pattern. An iambic foot consists of one unstressed syllable followed by one stressed syllable. So you can hear it in these words that they give you examples: repose, belief, complete. All right, so those are all unstressed followed by stressed. Now, iambic is the most common poetic foot in the English verse. I'm sure you guys have heard it. Iambic pentameter is the benchmark for Shakespearean sonnets, okay? Unrhymed iambic pentameter is also known as blank verse, but this is, again, the most popular, most common poetic foot in the English verse. A couple of lines that demonstrate the pattern of iambic feet. Behold and watch the sun destroy and grow. You can hear sort of the rhythm that is created by the unstressed, stressed combination. When I do count the clock that tells the time, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Come live with me and be my love. All right, so iambic creates this very particular pattern. On the other side of the iambic, if you switch over to stressed followed by an unstressed syllable, then what you have is the trochaic pattern. You can see a couple of words that follow the trochaic pattern: garland, speaking, value. So those all are stressed syllable followed by stressed syllable. You see an example of a poem that follows the trochaic pattern. Okay, so the iambic and trochaic patterns are the two-syllable patterns that we have. All right. The next two, anapestic and dactylic, are 3-syllable patterns. So in any given poem that you're looking at, as far as meter is concerned, the pattern you're going to find is always going to be either anapestic, it's always going to be either a 2-syllable pattern or a 3-syllable pattern. If it's 2-syllable, then it's going to be either iambic or trochaic. If it's 3-syllable, then it's going to be either anapestic or dactylic. Now, anapestic pattern is 2 unstressed syllables followed by a stressed syllable. So terms like on the road, interrupt, unabridged, contradict, engineer, masquerade, Galilee, these all follow the anapestic pattern. All right, so this idea of the scansion process. I know I discussed this before we went on this long break. We're going to go into more detail about this right now. Okay, so the scansion process, on the opposite side of the anapestic, we have the dactylic, which is a stressed syllable followed by 2 unstressed. So words like happiness, galloping, fortunate, Saturday, daffodil, murmuring, and rhapsody all follow that dactylic pattern. Then we have an example, Charge of the Light Brigade, that follows the dactylic pattern throughout. All right, so lastly, we have the spondaic pattern. This one's a little bit different. The spondaic pattern is where all of the syllables in a word have equal stress. Okay, now because of this feature, most poems are not going to be solely spondaic. You're never really going to find a poem. It's pretty much impossible to write a poem, especially a lengthy poem, where every syllable is stressed. So more than likely where you will see a spondaic pattern is occurring within a poem that already has another dominant rhythm scheme, has another dominant meter, which brings me to the notion of dominant meter. Okay, when you are scanning a poem, say that you decide to scan every single line of a poem. You're looking at a sonnet, say. All right, it's 14 lines in a sonnet. You scan every single line of the poem. There's very likely in some instances that some lines might not follow exactly the same pattern as every other line. Okay, in that instance, what you're going to do is identify what the most used pattern is within that poem, and then that is the dominant meter. That is that poem's meter. Okay, so that's what we mean when we say dominant rhythm scheme. All right, so once you've identified the type of foot, so you figured out whether it's iambic, trochaic, anapestic, or dactylic, then you have to count how many of those feet occur in each line. And that will give you the second part of what the poem's meter is. All right, you can see in the chart on the slide the corresponding number of feet to the word that describes that number of feet in a line. 1 foot per line is monometer, 2 feet per line dimeter, 3 feet per line trimeter, 4 feet per line tetrameter, 5 feet per line pentameter, and 6 feet per line hexameter. All right, so this chart breaks down the process of coming up with the meter of a poem. Okay, so once you figured out the type of poetic foot, then you count the number of lines or the number of those poetic feet within a line. You combine those two and you get the name of the meter. All right, so you're going to figure out first using scansion whether the poem follows a pattern of iambic, trochaic, anapestic, or dactylic, and then you count how many of those instances are in each line, and then you come up with whether it's monometer, dimeter, trimeter, tetrameter, pentameter, or hexameter. Typically, this part we would do face-to-face in class, as a class, but obviously that's not possible right now. So you can see if a poem has 1 foot per line, and that foot is unstressed followed by stressed, then the meter of that poem is iambic monometer. If a poem has 3 feet per line, and each foot is unstressed followed by stressed, then the meter of that poem is iambic trimeter. If a poem has 5 feet per line and each foot is unstressed followed by stress. Now, we discussed last class, or a couple weeks ago, we discussed the idea. And lastly, if we have a poem that has 3 feet per line and each of those feet are stressed followed by unstressed, then what we is trochaic trimeter. All right, so here's a breakdown of a simplification of the process for scanning a poem. Make sure that you are familiar with this, as it will be part of your poetry analysis, which is coming up soon. All right. Now, typically, this is the lesson more than any other lesson that I would have loved to have done face-to-face with you guys, just because it can get fairly confusing trying to explain the whole idea of stress versus unstressed and marking symbols and all of that other stuff. So I do urge you to watch this again if you don't understand it. And if you still have some issues with the concept, make sure that you email me. You guys have my email address. You can also message me through Blackboard. I will be checking it very frequently.